I appear this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with him. Frederick Douglass.
Throughout the 1800s, America, supposedly the land of the free, was torn by slavery. While many Southerners believed that subject to be a necessary evil, abolitionists in the North claimed that it was a violation of the freedom and basic concepts around which America was built. Before long, the nation was divided into two. Most states north of Virginia outlawed slavery, while Virginia and the rest of the South endorsed it. Arguments broke out as abolitionists and slavery advocates around the country continued to fight about slavery and the laws surrounding it. Often, Northerners would hide escaped slaves using the Underground Railroad to help them reach free territories, which infuriated the South. Trying to keep the peace, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which outlawed the hiding and protection of slaves and required Northerners to return escaped slaves to their owners. Slave catching quickly became a popular, yet corrupt business, in which slave catchers would capture escaped slaves and return them to their owners for a fee. However, they would often kidnap free slaves and sell them, unless their former owners were willing to speak on their behalf. With the taking of Kansas and Nebraska into the Union in 1854, and the introduction of popular sovereignty, arguments turned into violence. Seeing the violence and deciding the time for action had come when his son wrote him a desperate letter pleading for help, radical abolitionist John Brown moved into Kansas with a small band of men and brutally murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers, thus formally marking in blood the beginning of a notorious 3-year campaign by Brown to crush slavery by force. A fugitive because of the murders, John Brown spent the next several years avoiding the law and quietly trying to undermine slavery.
When I read about him as a young person, I was tremendously fascinated by the kind of fiery complexity of Brown and in the way that he faced the racial contradictions of this country head on 150 years ago.
The murders in Kansas, known as the Potawatomi Massacre, seriously slowed the immigration of slaveholders into newborn western states. Brown became a hero to slaves and abolitionists nationwide. In an attempt to revolutionize America, Brown began amassing weapons for an invasion of the South in 1857. To kick off the campaign, he planned to invade the Federal Armory at the small railroad town of Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and make off with its store of over 100,000 muskets and rifles. He also expected mass slave revolution, or uprising, to occur and become his army, with which he would tour the South, freeing and arming slaves all throughout, and then move into the Appalachian Mountains and construct a stronghold for his men to live and defend themselves in.
There's no doubt that Brown attacked here because this place was a symbol of American power, a symbol of federal government power. Again, one of only 2 United States armories, gun factories, in the nation. The only other one was in Springfield, Massachusetts. And the arsenal here had 100,000 weapons in it.
In preparation for the events, Brown rented a small farmhouse in Sandy Hook, Maryland, just outside of Harpers Ferry, and used it as a headquarters for him and his men while he prepared for the raid and waited for volunteer forces to arrive. Though he did not gain the turnout of hundreds of men he was expecting, slowly but surely people came. In all, John Brown's Provisional Army numbered 21. Finally, on October 16th of 1859, Brown, who is now a staggering 59 years old, and his 21 followers, 3 of them being his own sons, Oliver, Owen, and Watson, snuck into Harpers Ferry and cut the telegraph wires. Fearing that word would reach Washington, D.C., they also held up a passing train for over 5 hours before letting it go on its way. Sadly, though, before they released the train, a freed slave named Hayward Shepherd, who was working on the train, confronted them and was shot, ironically making a free African American the first casualty of the raid. After letting the midnight train pass, the raiders quickly took over the poorly manned arsenal and captured all of the guards as well as several citizens from the town. They began their work of securing the weapons they came for. However, at daybreak, local militia and many citizens began shooting at Brown. Shortly after, realizing that there would be no escape, Brown and his men barricaded themselves inside the tiny Harper's Ferry engine house.
Well, it's about 36 hours of action, and for the first 10 or 12 hours, Brown seemed to have had everything that he wanted. He captured the armory, the arsenal, the rifle factory. That's 31 federal buildings. He captured the B&O Railroad Bridge and the Shenandoah Wagon Bridge, and he took almost 40 hostages from the local population, freed about a dozen slaves. And then events started to unravel, spin out beyond his control.
Later, after hours of failed negotiations and bitterness after John Brown's son Oliver was shot while carrying a white flag, Jeb Stuart confronted those of the raiders that hadn't been killed or deserted their leader under a white flag, and offered one last chance for Brown to turn himself in peacefully. After a solid refusal, Stuart signaled the waiting detachment of U.S. Marines led by Robert E. Lee. The Marines stormed the engine house, killing or capturing all of John Brown's remaining men. Israel Green, the designated soldier of the day, knocked John Brown unconscious in a futile attempt to kill him.
The Marine lieutenant who tried to kill John Brown with his sword wasn't prepared for a battle. Instead of a heavy, sharpened battle saber, he had a parade weapon in his scabbard, which had a blunt tip and a flimsy blade. And when he thrust at John Brown, that blade on that sword bent in half.
Though not fatal, the blow from Green's sword left a respectable wound from which Brown would never recover. When John Brown woke up several minutes later outside the engine house, he was dazed and confused, but was respectful, even friendly to his captors. He was incarcerated at Jefferson County Prison for several weeks before his trial. On October 26, 1859, 10 days after the beginning of the raid, Brown and his surviving accomplices were tried for conspiring with slaves to rebel, treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, and several counts of murder. During his court testimony, Brown gave an inspiring speech in which he stated his innocence and claimed he deserved no punishment. However, he also accepted the death he knew was looming in front of his near future.
Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood farther with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done.
Despite such a brave testimony, as well as evidence-backed accusations that he was insane and not responsible for his actions, John Brown was convicted of all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. However, certain facts concerning the nature of the trial remain sketchy. For one, the raiders were charged with state offenses, even though Harper's Ferry was a national armory. It is believed that part of the reason for this is that the current president of the day, James Buchanan, did not want to be involved with the trial, and as a way of pushing it out of sight and thus out of mind, placed the burden of trying John Brown upon the state of Virginia. It is also deemed strange that almost the entire jury was comprised of slave-owning Virginians, possibly causing it to be biased. However it happened, Brown's lawyers could not reverse the charges. Brown was returned to his prison cell and stayed there for the next month. On December 2nd, 1859, the day John Brown was to be hanged, thousands of soldiers and citizens appeared at the site of the gallows in Jefferson County, near the prison John Brown had been staying at. Fearing a rescue attempt, no slaves or freed blacks were allowed in the area. Brown himself was tightly bound and forced to ride upon his own coffin on the way to the gallows, where he was to be publicly slaughtered. This time, there was no words from the old man. He rode quietly, did not resist, and walked with courage that has been witnessed very few times since. At high noon of December 2nd, 1859, with a bag placed over his head to shield his death throes from the witnessing eyes, the 59-year-old abolitionist that stunned Northerners and Southerners alike was put to death.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But his soul goes marching